Speaker, I rise on behalf of the Green Party to analyse, I guess, the government's budget, but also its economic direction and the path that they seem to be taking the country. I think we have a pretty clear choice in front of us. We have the National Party's pollution economy, which is the direction that they're proposing to take the country, versus a smart green economy. And I think that in this election and in front of us at the moment with this appropriation and the government's budget, we've got a pretty clear sense of the different paths that are open to New Zealand. And so if you look at the economic performance of the country under this government, it's a simplified economy. So as time has progressed, our export profile has become simpler and simpler. So whether you're looking at milk solids, which obviously is probably the mainstay of the government's economic agenda, or whether you're looking at raw logs, which now over 50% of all forest trees felled now are simply exported as raw logs, that's the government's strategy, or whether you're looking at oil and gas, these are the key parts of the National Party's economic agenda. It is a very simple, very low value-add, commodity-based approach to economic development. And that is where they're directing the New Zealand economy towards that kind of simplified commodity exports. Now, the problem with this strategy is that, well, there's a number of problems, but there's the first problem with this strategy, obviously, is that it has pretty low value add. So it's pretty hard to become prosperous when you are a simple commodity producer, and it's a pretty low value add strategy. But on top of that, we're running into these very significant environmental constraints. So if you look, for example, at the agri-food sector, the government strategy of more and more volume, so increased milk powder production every year, is having this dramatic impact on the rivers and lakes across New Zealand. Because as every scientific study has shown, if you increase the volume of production, you very soon start to have this very dramatic impact on rivers and lakes, which of course are downstream of intensive agriculture. So as the government has subsidised industrial dairy and subsidised dairy production, we've had these very big consequences for our rivers and lakes. Now, the government has said that we should just accept this as a kind of Faustian bargain, if you like, that we just, in order to pay our way in the world, we have to accept that we're going to have toxic rivers, is essentially the National Party's position. There is, of course, a different strategy, which is the smart green strategy, which has been promoted by the Redette Institute, which is the Institute of Agri-Food Research based out of Massey University and is the leading voice for the agri-food sector, which is much more about value add and innovation, the very opposite of the strategy being pursued by this government. In order for that to happen, of course, you have to invest in research and development. Now, if you look at the government's projections in their own documents, they're proposing to cut investment in research and development, as they said in their draft National Statement of Science Investment. They're proposing to cut investment in research and development by 10% in real terms over the next 3 years, whereas the Green Party is proposing to increase investment in research and development and innovation over the next 3 years by $1 billion. But it's not just about the quantum of the amount of money you spend on R&D, but that clearly is significant. It's also about how you do it. So when the government came in, it abolished the research and development tax credit. Now, the thing about an R&D tax credit is every business gets to direct its own innovation and its own R&D spending and then get some support from the taxpayer for that R&D spending. What the National Party replaced it with was a series of grants which Stephen Joyce controls. So Stephen Joyce sits there and picks the winners. He says, OK, you're going to get some government money in the form of R&D grants, but only if you satisfy my particular criteria and I happen to like your business, and all the other businesses won't get any money to support them for R&D. So instead of picking innovation as the winner, which is what the Green Party approach is, the National Party picks particular individual businesses who get money from Stephen Joyce through the research and development grants. It is a very different strategy, which is kind of ironic because, of course, the government goes on and on about not picking winners, but when it comes to research and development funding, that's exactly what they are doing. They abolished the R&D tax credits, which gives all businesses the freedom to innovate, gives all businesses the opportunity to get some support to do research and development, and replaces it with Stephen Joyce picking individual companies and saying, you're going to get an R&D tax credit. Now, Stephen Joyce is a bright guy, no question about it, and I kind of acknowledge him as a worthy opponent. But the thing is, in spite of that, Stephen Joyce cannot know what are the right businesses to pick across the whole of the New Zealand economy, which are the right businesses to direct R&D support towards in order to pick the winners that are going to come out of it. Stephen Joyce just isn't that smart. Nobody is that smart. That's why the majority of OECD countries use research and development tax credits to support innovation across their whole economy. And that's what the Green Party proposes, which is the exact antithesis of picking winners, which is what the National Party policy is through its R&D tax grants. We get a similar kind of issue in what you might call investigator-led research or science. So the Marsden Fund, which is basically says here's money to scientists so that they can do science and so that they can investigate things and do research, if not development. That is open-ended. It says investigators pursue things. The government is moving funds away from Marsden and into the science challenges, which has meant that lots of scientists are extremely critical of the science challenges. And what the science challenges are is, again, Stephen Joyce has picked these 10 science challenges and says, I'm going to direct a whole bunch of money into those instead of supporting the sciences more generally, instead of supporting investigator-led research, whereby researchers try to investigate problems and come up with solutions, which tends to produce those kind of breakthroughs which are incredibly valuable for society as well as the economy more generally. Once again, the heavy dead hand of Stephen Joyce is upon innovation in our country. So Stephen Joyce's heavy hand sits on innovation in the R&D tax, the R&D credits. So you get a grant if Stephen Joyce approves it, whereas the other system that the Green Party is proposing is an R&D tax credits. We give all businesses the freedom to innovate. And then we see the same thing in what you might call more pure science, where instead of actually supporting science across the board, where scientists are given support to investigate things, Stephen Joyce is picking 10 particular science challenges, and his dead heavy hand sits on it and says, if you're not doing something which meets all these criteria, you haven't filled out all these forms, filled out all this bureaucracy, you're not going to get the money. And that is the contrast between what the Green Party is proposing for a smarter, greener economy versus the National Party, which are picking winners in dirty industries. So the National Party's pollution economy says if you're creating pollution, you're probably going to get a grant, because that's what the National Party is going to support. If you're doing simple commodities, yes, you'll get some money. If you're doing dairy powder, if you're doing milk powder, then of course the National Party will support you. If you're doing oil and gas, it turns out you'll get massive support from the National Party government for what you're doing. But if you're involved in innovation in all these other different fields, which there's no way any one person can understand the full field of innovation, you don't get support from this government. And that is, I think, the stark contrast. The pollution economy supported by the National Party versus a smarter, greener, innovative economy promoted by the Green Party. There's also a lack in the National Party's budget for all the simple things. So there's no price on carbon. The Green Party put up a proposal for a carbon tax cut, where we put a price on carbon and return the revenue to income earners in the form of a tax cut. The first $2,000 will be free of taxes, income taxes, under the Green Party's carbon tax cut. Plus, we cut the company tax rate 1 point from 28% to 27%. The idea of that is to create a very strong incentive for those businesses that are efficient in greenhouse emissions, the kind of businesses we need to grow to protect our climate, but also to build a resilient New Zealand economy in a carbon-constrained world. Instead, the National Party says carbon's free, you can create as much pollution as you want. In fact, the government will subsidise it. Same with water pollution. The National Party will subsidise it. Actually, they've got the signals exactly the wrong way around if we want to build a resilient green economy that will actually prosper in the years ahead. Mr. Speaker, finally, if I just finish on the issue of fiscal conservatives, the National Party opposed every budget when they were in opposition to cut government debt. They said the surpluses, when Labor was in government, should be spent on giving tax cuts to the rich. And that meant, now fortunately National were in opposition, so they lost all of those debates and we were able to cut government debt very significantly. As soon as National got into office, what did they do? They started borrowing again. They've never run a surplus, not a single surplus. They gave tax cuts to the rich. They had to borrow over $5 billion to fund tax cuts for the rich. It is ridiculous. They are the most fiscally irresponsible government we have had in living memory in New Zealand, and whether they're in opposition or whether they're in government, the National Party are not fiscal conservatives. They are the exact opposite.
Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I always seem to get to follow the Greens, which is a little bit frustrating.